Today's Wednesday, June the 4th, and I think it's become apparent to everybody now that the United States has zero interest in cutting their debt. And, it would have been nice to see them do it, but I can't think of an instance ever, and not that I'm the smartest person in the world, but I can't think of an instance ever where governments have reduced their spending once the wheels have been put in motion towards spending more. And then it got me thinking about the average business owner. And I think that the average business owner is flying by the seat of their pants. They oftentimes have a rough idea of how much debt they're holding, along with the assets that they kind of in their head say, this will pay off our debt. But I thought there was three important points to note that sort of track the philosophy that the US government is adopting. And just real quick, that philosophy is we're not really going to cut, but we're going to bank on being able to grow our way out of this problem. And I think there's an important lesson in there for us business owners and entrepreneurs that are out in the world every day trying to create some value. And so if you've run a business for long enough, you know that you can't cut your way to profitability. There's no such thing as making your P&L, your P&L so small that you're doing nothing but generating profitability. There's just no way to do that. What cutting expenses does is it allows the business to pick up that money that's just lying on the ground. In our business, as an example, we were paying US about $1,100, $1,200 a month for a project management system that really was just a glorified Excel worksheet. And I made the decision a year ago, given the advancements in AI, that we were just going to dump that cost in exchange for putting a proprietary system in place that I built. Now, I happen to have a background in this. I happen to enjoy programming as a hobby, so that, of course, works to my advantage. But we're now saving $1,200 a month, and in saving that $1,200 a month, it didn't necessarily make us more profitable. It didn't help us attract more revenue. But what it did do is make sure that we were spending the right amount of money for the right amount of value that was being created. And so when you look at the cost of Microsoft Excel, it's $50 a month or whatever that price is, versus a project management system, which was like $1,200 a month. There's a big spread there. And if I could get the cost closer to a couple $100s a month by utilizing our own database and then some hosting for a front end, like a user interface, web pages, then I was able to bring our costs down to something that was right-sized for the kind of workload and revenue that we're generating. So you can't cut your way to profitability, but what you can do is make sure that your costs are contributing to adding value. And so in that same way that I was able to build a proprietary project management system, on the other end, we also, instead of having a full-time safety officer who does nothing but visit our job sites and keep everyone, and they're on our payroll as a health and safety officer, for our level of revenue, it doesn't make sense to carry that payroll burden. So instead, what we did is we used technology to manage our safety program, and it costs us, I think it costs us about $5,500 a year. But we reconfigured our business processes so that instead of paying somebody $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 a year, we're now paying $5,500 a year. And we have now given our workforce the ability to manage a live safety program through daily reporting, through weekly follow-ups, and then through monthly safety meetings. And so we do have a point person on our team for health and safety, but we don't have a full-time position for health and safety because we were able to offload the cost somewhere else. So you can't cut your way to profitability. And two, you need to make sure that your costs are contributing or adding value. And when you think of a dedicated safety person at our revenue level, they weren't adding value as much as they were a necessary cost for us to be in the business to generate revenue. And I was able to take that very necessary cost and reduce it from $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 a year down to $5,500 a year. Plus, we were able to improve our business processes so that instead of having a static safety program that was managed by an individual, we now have a live safety program that's incorporated into our daily, weekly, and monthly workflow. And then lastly, I've always thought it interesting that if you were forced to cut expenses, so you absolutely must cut, say, 30% of your expenses, how would you do that? because say your debt's out of control and the cost of your interest and your payments is killing you. So somewhere you can't not make the payments, so you got to find the cut somewhere else. So if you had to find 30% or 20% or 40%, how would you do that? Well, in our business, what we did during COVID is instead of paying everybody for the hour for a 40-hour work week, what we did instead is every time we won a job, we figured out what a competitive hourly rate for the job would be, and then we made it piecework. So we said, we've budgeted for this job to take 5 days. If you finish the job in 4 days, we'll still pay you as if you worked 5 days. And so what that enabled us to do is it enabled us to cut our payroll overhead and instead forced everybody in the same direction towards finding work, winning work, and then getting it done. And so instead of a big payroll line item, we were able to reduce our payroll that had to go out every Friday and instead turned it into piecework. And overall, it actually made us more profitable. Had we not moved everyone to piecework at that really critical time in our business, I don't think we would have survived, because we simply would have drained the amount of money we had, and there wouldn't have been the same level of incentive or energy put into finding the next project. And so when we aligned everybody's interests in the same direction, nobody got a paycheck unless we found a job, did the job, and won the job. All of a sudden, we were able to use that strategy for almost 2 years during the tail end of COVID to get us back onto stable ground. And then once we were on stable ground and we had grown our revenue over sort of a baseline amount that we were working towards, then we were able to flip everyone back onto a 40-hour work week with regular paychecks every Friday. We took away the piecework and instead incentivized based on a project bonus once the check came in. So if you've got a bunch of debt, like the US government has, you can't cut your way to profitability. Ultimately, you do have to grow out of the problem. But before you hit the growth path, it is important to check your costs to make sure that all the costs that you're incurring are in fact necessary. For the costs you think are necessary, there might be a different way to spend that money. And then lastly, if you did have to cut costs, what are some creative ways that you can use that cut to in turn do the ultimate, which is grow your business? And so if you can't cut your way to profitability, then the only other thing you do is grow your way to profitability. And everybody knows that sales cures all. The more selling you can do, the more revenue you can generate. That's ultimately how you dig yourself out of a hole. In the United States, they're hoping that between AI, robotics manufacturing, nuclear power, or what have you, they're hoping that they can kind of enter this new era of innovation and growth. And I think businesses need to adopt that same mentality, because the costs are in a business what the costs are. In Canada, huge regulatory costs, huge payroll costs. The burden of administration is real. And those costs really, you can manage them, you can trim them, but you can't cut them to nothing. You still have to run your business. So there's a time to focus on cutting expenses. But if they are what they are, then you got to go the other way and say, how can we grow? How can we grow our revenue? In our business, we had kind of one service that we provided. Thanks to COVID and the pressure that put on us and the piecework, et cetera, we were able to develop 2 or 3 other lines of business that came out of that are now just basically the foundation of what we do as a company. So we now do more than we did 5 years ago. And that was out of necessity, because we just had to grow. We had to go find revenue. And it wasn't a clean line. There were a lot of different steps we had to take to get there. But ultimately now we've arrived in a place where the wind's at our back. We've got nothing but opportunity in front of us because the market has recovered. And now our opportunity is to double our revenue while maintaining a really, really tight cost center in what we do. And then who knows what happens in the coming years after that. But I thought, if the US government is what it is and they're not going to cut their debt, and certainly in Canada, I just can't ever see that happening. If you've got to play the game on the field is you're going to spend a certain amount of money to run your business. spend a certain amount of money to run the government. So if you can't cut those costs because of competing interests or because of necessity, then the only other thing you can do is start growing your revenue. And so as a business owner, I think that's important to remember, that you can't cut your way to profitability. You can manage your costs appropriately, but you really got to make sure every single cost is contributing to value creation. And that value creation is ultimately how you start growing your revenue. So that's what I'm thinking about today, figuring out how to, once you've got your cost dialed in, I'm figuring out how do we grow our revenue. And if you've listened to the last bunch of episodes, you know some of the things that I'm working on to do that for our Calgary business so that we can grow it, stabilize it, and give people a really great place to learn. It's interesting that I was reading in my daily Bible study today. I was in Proverbs, let me see what I'm in here, Proverbs 6. And there's a 6 kind of verse, let's see here, 1-5, which basically talks about if you've borrowed money, allow no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids, free yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the snare of a fowler, meaning if you owe someone money, work like a dog to make sure you can get rid of that debt as quickly as possible. And the answer to that, why, is if you kind of jump ahead, Matthew 6:24, you can't serve two masters. You're either going to hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. So you can't love your business, want to create a bunch of value, but at the same time, be serving your creditors. Everybody knows you have to take on debt in order for a business to work. But as a business owner, your goal should be trying to get to positive cash flow. And in a different episode, I will share with you some thoughts about what that has meant for me as I've buried myself in debt and had to crawl my way out a couple of times. But really, you want to steward your business really well. Debt is a tool, but ultimately you do want to get to a place where you're not personally signing for the debt, you're not putting your house on the line for the debt, and that you're building a business that can support any kind of debt all by itself, so that if the business comes to ruin, it doesn't ruin you and your family. So lots of things to think about there when we think about debt, we think about governments, how they treat it, and then down at the individual business level, that's how I think about it. And hopefully you found some of that helpful.